Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Autumn Cabell, and I will be presenting today for the AMCD Writers Consortium a 30-minute community chat on turning your dissertation into a publication. The objectives for this presentation include discussing strategies to turn your dissertation into a manuscript or multiple manuscripts, sharing tips on submitting your manuscripts to academic counseling journals, and 3, explaining considerations that you might have for authorship. So first, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Cabell. I'm an assistant professor in counseling at DePaul University. I graduated May 2020 with my PhD in counselor education and supervision from Virginia Commonwealth University. And I started in my current position as a tenure track assistant professor in September of 2020. And my research interest includes examining the career development and mental health of historically underrepresented students in STEM and developing interventions that improve their career and persistence outcomes, and also addressing the career development of historically underrepresented counselors and counselors in training. If you're interested in getting in touch with me, you can shoot me an email at acabell@depaul.edu. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at CNWDR. If you have any questions about the AMCD Writers Consortium, you can contact writers@amcd.info for more information. So for this presentation, I'm going to share some lessons learned from my recent experience publishing 2 articles that were based off of my dissertation study. I'm going to discuss strategies for turning your dissertation into a manuscript or multiple manuscripts and selecting counseling journals, and also give you some tips to consider around navigating authorship. So a little bit about my experience. I defended my dissertation in March of 2020. My dissertation was entitled A Longitudinal Study of the Influence of a STEM Career Planning Course and Perceived Stress on Career Search, Self-Efficacy, and Retention in Engineering Undergraduate Students. So one of those long dissertation titles. And my dissertation included 3 research questions. And so after I defended my dissertation in March 2020, I really made an effort to not look at it again for a couple months. And so I gave myself a break and revisited turning it into manuscripts the summer of 2020. So I gave myself, 2-3 months even to just decompress after the dissertation process, celebrate as much as I could, and just take a step back. But ultimately, I ended up writing 2 manuscripts over the summer and submitted them to 2 different ACA counseling journals, the Journal of Counseling and Development and the Career Development Quarterly. And both manuscripts were accepted and are now in press. So as far as just my timeline for submitting these manuscripts, I submitted one just before my contract started at DePaul University, and one right after when my contract started. And that was intentional because I wanted those potential publications at the time to count towards my tenure at DePaul. And so I took into account the review process and having maybe some revisions, and decided that right before and right after my contract would give me enough time to hear back, and it would potentially count towards my tenure. One of those manuscripts that I developed was based directly from one of my research questions. So I basically wrote about my research question 3 and all of the findings that were associated with that. And also the other was developed from a combination of one of my research questions and also an exploratory analysis that I did. So the manuscripts that I submitted and the publications that I have coming out, one is directly related to my dissertation study, but the other is kind of a combination of different things that I did. And so they don't exactly align with how I wrote my dissertation and how I articulated my research questions in my dissertation. And so just starting with some lessons that I learned through my process and publishing based off my dissertation. So first, things that I did that were unhelpful was submitting the manuscript to a journal that was not the right fit. So the first time I submitted one of my manuscripts, it was actually a desk reject. And it kind of ties into my second point about doubting myself. So I didn't submit my dissertation or the manuscript based off of my dissertation to my kind of top choice for that manuscript, which was the Career Development Quarterly, because I didn't believe that it was strong enough and that it would get accepted. And so I ended up submitting to a different journal that was just not the right fit for that manuscript. And it showed in that desk rejection. And so I could have maybe saved myself some of that hurt around getting my first manuscript from my dissertation rejected if I had had more confidence in myself and my work from the beginning. And it would have been, my ideal journal and also, not have had that experience. Also, something that was unhelpful for me was becoming too attached to my dissertation. So I mentioned that one of my manuscripts was based off of one of my research questions, but also on this exploratory analysis that I did in my dissertation. And so it was really hard for me to break up my research questions at first because I was attached to all that I had wrote, all of the 100 and plus pages that were in my dissertation and how I wrote it in that way and with those research questions. And so just kind of getting too attached to the finished project that was my dissertation made it a little bit difficult for me to think about how my dissertation could be multiple articles at first. However, some things that I did that were helpful is one, starting with ACA journals and starting there as potential homes for my manuscripts. Also, asking my chair for help. So my chair had more experience publishing in one of the journals that accepted my manuscript, and receiving that help and his feedback and guidance along the process of editing the manuscript and ultimately submitting the manuscript was incredibly helpful in allowing it to go through the process and ultimately get accepted at that journal. Another thing that I did that was helpful was starting early. And what I mean by starting early is using some of that time after I took a break to step away to just write those manuscripts and hold on to them. So that way, when I started my position, I already had things that would be under review or soon be under review. And I didn't really have to worry about, transitioning to a new job, moving, doing course prep, all at the same time as worrying about publications. Because I had started early with writing those manuscripts and held on to them for a little while, it alleviated some of that initial stress and pressure to just publish right away in my first year. And it gave me some leeway, at least in regards to research at first, as I was just starting off into my first counselor educator position. Another thing that I did that was helpful was strategically developing a timeline to write and to submit. And this also connects to the next point about taking a break. So even in that timeline, I incorporated being intentional about taking a break. after March 2020, when I defended my dissertation, I didn't revisit it until July 2020 in order to write those manuscripts. So I still set that timeline where I wanted to have finished manuscripts done in the summer. So that way, when the fall semester started, I wasn't writing on top of course prep, on top of transitioning and meeting people and things like that. And so just being strategic about what I needed, including a break in that timeline, was something that was helpful for me. Another thing that I did that was helpful is that I attended a Ask the Editor session for the Journal of Counseling and Development. I believe that ACES held this webinar session, and the editor spoke about his vision for JCD and what he the types of manuscripts he might be interested in publishing. And that was really helpful in giving me the confidence to submit to JCD, because at first I was a little bit apprehensive. But even just hearing other people's questions, hearing the editor talk was something that was helpful for me. And so I would recommend that if you have the opportunity to go to one of those Ask the Editor sessions for whatever journal you're thinking about submitting to, definitely take advantage of that. So next, talking about strategies for developing your manuscript and selecting a journal for your manuscript. A good place to start is with your research questions for your dissertation. Looking at your research questions and deciding whether you want to develop one or if there's potentially multiple manuscripts that could come from the research questions that you asked in your dissertation. And a way to help you think about this and navigate that is through consultation with your dissertation chair and possibly your committee members as well. They can really help you brainstorm where are places where it might be helpful to break up your dissertation into multiple manuscripts. Another helpful tip is just to recognize that your dissertation is a done project now, and that the manuscripts that you might have as a result of your dissertation might not be an exact reflection of your dissertation, because manuscripts are limited in the page numbers and scope. You just don't have 100 and something pages to talk about your research when you're submitting manuscripts. And so being able to accept that the dissertation is finished, it's a finished product, and that you're now developing a new product in the manuscript or manuscripts that you submit to journals. So some more strategies and things to consider, especially when selecting a journal, is to one, think about starting with the ACA family journals, or at least the journals that represent your professional home. So for example, ASCA and the Professional School Counselor, or AMHCA with the Journal of Mental Health Counseling. Think about submitting your dissertation to, or your manuscripts based off your dissertation to journals that you see yourself continuing to publish in the future and that represent your professional identity as a counselor educator. You also want to think about that implication section of your manuscript. Who do you want to be reading your work? And who were your implications written for? Are the implications for counselor educators? Are they for counselors? Maybe that makes a difference of where that manuscript finds its home. Also, some things that you might want to consider is the impact factor, or at least the acceptance rate of the journal or journals that you're considering. For some tenure track positions, the impact factor of the journals is something that might come up in your tenure review. And so it could just be helpful to get a leg up and get your first one or two manuscripts in journals where the impact factor is higher in comparison to some of our other counseling journals, or at least the acceptance rate is a little bit more competitive. Also, something to consider is to start with your ideal fit for your manuscript and format your manuscript to that top choice that you have. However, also be able to identify maybe 2 to 3 other journals that could potentially be a home for your manuscript as well. And so along with kind of submitting to your top choice and formatting the manuscript to your top choice, also reviewing recent articles in that journal for both the content, the type of articles that are published in that journal, and the style of the writing and of the articles that are in that journal. Also, in helping you to develop a professional timeline around writing your manuscripts and submitting them for publication, it might also be helpful to try to find out information on the review timeline for that journal. Oftentimes, this is on the journal's author guidelines section. They might talk about the review timeline, or information that's on the journal's website, or also by even asking committee members or faculty in your program if they know or have had a recent experience with that journal, to get a sense of what that review timeline and publication timeline is like for the journal. Another thing that you can consider is presenting at conferences on your dissertation topic in order to help people gain interest in a potential manuscript that could be coming out from your dissertation, and also meeting editors and asking them questions about their journal as well. So some things to consider about authorship is that it's not required that your chair and committee members are on your manuscripts or manuscript that you submit. However, it's typically good practice, considerate and respectful, to at least include your chair on the manuscript or the manuscripts that you end up submitting. You might also want to consider asking committee members who have experience publishing in your target journal to help you with turning your dissertation into a manuscript and being authors on that manuscript as well. And when thinking about asking committee members for their help with the manuscript, also keep in mind your own timeline. And so reaching out to committee members who have the time to give you feedback on a manuscript and give you guidance on developing the manuscript. So that way you're on target with your own personal timeline that you've developed for submitting that manuscript for publication. And so thinking about some implications or just next steps for both doctoral students and new faculty is, one, for doctoral students, first finish your dissertation. Remember that a done dissertation is a good dissertation. And as you're finishing up those final chapters and edits of your dissertation, start thinking about how the research questions, how even the literature review and the findings might lend itself to multiple papers. So you don't have to wait until you're totally done in order to start thinking and brainstorming whether this could be one manuscript or maybe 2 or 3 manuscripts from your dissertation. And also, as you're finishing up your dissertation, develop that timeline for yourself on when you want to start writing and when you want to submit that manuscript. And take into account taking a break. Dissertation is a long, daunting process, and you've almost finished with it or finished it. And so take a break to just relax, decompress, honor the accomplishment that you've made, and then get back in the game of writing and turning that dissertation into manuscripts as soon as you can, after kind of resetting and reevaluating your own wellness. Some next steps for new faculty members is to, one, keep your contract start dates and your tenure review in mind. You might consider, similar to what I did, delaying to submit your manuscript so that your publications count towards tenure. You might also place a stronger emphasis on that impact factor or that acceptance rate, and that might help you distinguish what that target journal is for yourself, because you're keeping in mind the new position that you might be entering into if it is a tenure track position. Also, for new faculty, you might want to consider using your dissertations and the future research section that you wrote to develop that next study as you start at your new position. So you have those manuscripts that you submit to journals, and now you're maybe starting on that next project that helps fill the next gap that you've identified from your dissertation and also from those manuscripts that you wrote based off of your dissertation. And so the last slide here is I just have some resources for you about, one is the link to the ACA Family Journals. Also just free online support regarding APA 7th edition. And the last one is the dissertation journey and a link to this book that can help give you some practical guidance along the dissertation process as well.